You are listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. Sustainable World Radio brings you in-depth interviews, news, and commentary about positive solutions to environmental challenges. Solutions that adhere to the permaculture ethics of earth care, people care, fair share. Are you interested in learning more about permaculture projects around the globe? How to plant a food forest? Restorative design or ethnobotany? Then stay tuned for Sustainable World Radio. I'm your host and producer, Jill Cloutier. Our guest today is Elizabeth Segran, a senior staff writer at Fast Company. Elizabeth's work has been published in The Atlantic, The New Republic, The Nation, and Salon. Welcome to Sustainable World Radio, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, I'm really excited about our topic today, and we're going to be talking about the fashion industry's impact on the environment and its contribution to climate change.
Ooh.
And if you're, I know, what a topic. If you're like me and you wear clothes, it's important to know how our clothing choices affect the health of our planet. So Elizabeth, before we get started into this topic, I just wanted to know what initially sparked your research into the ecological impacts of the fashion industry.
Well, I've been a fashion writer for many years now, looking at the business of fashion. But over the last 2 years, I would say, I think every business writer has become a sustainability writer on some level, because I think we're all aware that the massive problem of climate change is going to have a huge impact on business. And also that business itself has had a major impact on accelerating the pace of climate change. So those two things together made me realize that there was a lot for me to explore in the realm of the fashion industry. And that's where things got a little bit dicey, because actually the problem is that we don't actually have very good data about how fashion contributes to climate change and to many other environmental issues. And we know that it has a massive impact. I think that's clear. All of the studies that have been done suggest that the fashion industry, it's a huge global sector that employs hundreds of millions of people around the world. So we know that it has a really big impact. We just don't have a clear sense of what the numbers are, and so this has been an enduring source of fascination for me.
Mm-hmm. And so I think listeners would be really surprised, which I learned from one of your articles, to hear that the fashion industry is responsible, they think, for about 8% of global greenhouse gases.
Yeah, and that's that's an estimate that they came up with recently using more recent data. And they, what's shocking about that is that is higher than all international flights and maritime shipping combined, which is crazy when you think about how much anxiety you have about buying an airline ticket because of, the carbon emissions, in that process, versus like buying a t-shirt, which most of us don't think twice about, right?
Say we're looking at this t-shirt or this pair of jeans. How does that article of clothing contribute to climate change? Can you walk us through that a bit?
Yes, absolutely. So for one thing, we know that we're in a state of massive, massive overproduction when it comes to the fashion industry. So based on recent statistics, we know that about 100 billion articles of clothing are made every year. And that number keeps going up every year. And that's for only, less than 8 billion humans, right? So we're basically producing way more clothes than we need. And that is because of trends over the last couple of decades, including fast fashion, that have made clothes very inexpensive to make and to buy. And as a result, most of us are buying way more clothes than we need. So that's one part of the puzzle. But then when you think about the global supply chain, fashion really, is a huge industry. So if you take that one t-shirt, say it's made of, a cotton and polyester blend. So at the very, very start of that supply chain, we have to talk about the the cotton fields that could be in Bangladesh or in India, and those cotton fields require a lot of water. They require, farmers to be farming them. Most of the time, there's a lot of chemicals involved in that process. And then if you take the polyester, which actually, synthetics and plastic-based fibers make up about 60% of all clothes right now. That is essentially just oil. And so those are the two things that are going into that shirt. Those are the two raw materials going into that shirt. Then those raw materials are then, shipped to different parts of the world. It could be China, it could be Italy, where they're milled into fabrics. And then they're shipped again, sometimes back to their country of origin. So sometimes back to India or China to be cut and sewn into t-shirts or whatever it is, the final product is going to be. And then finally, after all of that, those garments are then shipped to wherever they're sold, in this case here in the United States. And then, if that object doesn't sell, then it ends up on the sales rack. And if it still doesn't sell after that, which is very likely given that brands are, as we said, overproducing, they're making way too many styles per season, then that shirt that has gone through all of that, long process, may end up getting thrown in a landfill or burned at the end of the season. So every stage of that process contributes to carbon emissions. And if you multiply that by all of the clothes that are made every year, then we have just an enormous problem on our hands.
And so those clothes go on a trip around the world.
Yeah.
So not only in the way that they're manufactured but also in the traveling. Oh my God, it's amazing. I never really thought of it like that.
There's the traveling and that's part of why we're overproducing in a way, because the global supply chain is so vast and enormous that it actually takes quite a while for a shirt to go from a design studio in New York or San Francisco to be a fully made product, because it goes through all of those steps. And that's an inefficiency that means that most fashion brands tend to overproduce. They're unclear what's going to be hot, what style is going to be hot in 6 months from now. So they might place a bet on a particular t-shirt. They might make several different types of t-shirts, hoping that one of them will be successful. That's partly why we're overproducing, because it's such a long time between creating a design and actually having it on shelves that actually creates a lot of inefficiencies and waste.
And talking about waste, not only the waste of, what you were saying, some clothes are burned that don't sell. So there's waste on that level. And then there's also the idea of new looks for every season. And how does the fashion industry create this demand for new styles that then might make many people just throw out clothes that aren't in style anymore?
Yeah. I mean, it's so fascinating when you think about fashion history, because if you go back 100 years, this entire supply chain did not exist yet. And so basically people had to make clothes locally. A lot of people made their own clothes. It was relatively expensive to get a hold of materials. So you were buying things, and keeping them for a lot longer, unless you were very wealthy. And in which case, if you happen to be, wealthy, then you would be able to wear the latest styles. And there you might have, a few new outfits every season. What the entire fashion industry did was it basically found a way to make it affordable for everybody to live like that, to have the latest looks every season. It democratized fashion, right? That was the whole point of building this entire supply chain. And so by now we're at this stage where that is the norm, where there's an industry that's churning out new clothes every season, and in order to continue at this pace and for the fashion industry to keep growing, it needs to convince you and I that we really need to have the newest looks. And so it does this through many, many ways. One way is it's just the seasonal style, which still is kind of an important way that the fashion industry works. So if you've heard of fashion weeks happening, twice a year, when designers show their styles, the fashion editors, that still informs a lot of how the fashion industry works today. So, those fashion shows are really important. Fashion designers, fashion magazines show up to events, to Fashion Week to see what's going to be in. And then, fashion brands will place bets on what styles are going to be in 6 months from now. And then they'll start placing orders, designing clothes, creating entire collections that will be out 6 months from now. And that's just like on the production side. On the other side, they have to be advertising those clothes to you, making you feel like, last year's looks are just not in anymore. They have to make you feel on this sort of subtle subconscious level that if you put on the outfit that you had last year, that somehow you're not in tune with what's going on. You're not on trend.
And it's always the opposite of what it was the year before, is what I've noticed.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there, it's weird, like how there's also color forecasting, which is something I wrote about recently, where, there are these companies like Pantone, which is a color forecasting company that basically helps you figure out what's going to be hot, 6 months to a year from now. And these fashion brands are very careful to stay on these colors. So it might be something where, you just go out and you're wearing like a bright fuchsia, dress, and you're in a sea of like sage green, right? And suddenly you just feel ridiculous wearing, the dress that you're wearing, which was fine the year before, right? And so there are all of these subtle and not so subtle ways that the fashion industry is doing this. And why are they doing this? Well, because the whole system sort of depends on it at this point.
That is really interesting how that works. And luckily, I'm pretty immune to this. I pretty much wear whatever clothes I have. I don't have a ton of money to spend on clothes. And I just wear pretty much, the same colors every year. But I do have friends and a couple of relatives who won't wear certain things and say they're out of style or no one's wearing them. So I think it's really interesting how many of us are internalizing this message.
Yeah, they do. And I think it's bad. I mean, I think that it needs to stop. And I think we need to change the way that we approach fashion, both as consumers and from, what these brands are doing. So I actually think that there's a couple of things that are happening now that seem to be sort of pushing back against this trend. One is that, from consumers themselves, I think consumers are beginning to realize that it's no fun being trapped in this cycle where you have too much stuff, which is just a burden, right? Like you have to decide what you're going to wear every day. And that's a stressful decision because you have so much stuff and you have to keep focused on the trends. I think consumers are tired of that. So there's been a move from consumers to kind of, sort of basically cut down on the number of clothes that they own. And in order to do that, many of the people who are part of this kind of lean closet, or that's one way that, this is being described, or, the capsule wardrobe kind of world, is that they're just picking a few key items that they love and that they wear frequently that tend to be in very neutral colors. And they find that is the best way for them to live kind of a lean closet lifestyle. That's happening on the consumer side. But then from the brand side, there are many brands, not enough, but there are several brands now that are kind of pushing towards selling very, neutral classic pieces. So I'm thinking about brands like A-Day, which is, a New York based brand that just sells kind of classic clothes. There are lots of brands like Everlane. There are brands that are really just trying to sell classic pieces that will last a long time. And then there are slightly older brands that have also been doing this for a long time, like Patagonia. Their aesthetic has basically not changed, over the decades that it's been around. And Eileen Fisher, which is a women's brand. I went into an Eileen Fisher store recently, and it was just a sea of neutrals. And those clothes you'll be able to wear for season after season. So I think that there's interest in shifting things away from this model. And so I think that it's just a matter of this continuing, so that the fashion industry sort of changes fundamentally on a structural level, how it interacts with customers and how it works through its supply chain.
Mm-hmm. And responsible manufacturing, because some of the facts in your article were really shocking. I think textile manufacturing consumes 98 million tons of non-renewable resources and 93 billion cubic meters of water annually. And that water that goes into the factory leaves very compromised and toxic.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you think about all the raw materials that go into these clothes, a lot of, as I mentioned before, it's strange to think about, but 60% of your clothes are made of plastic.
And that is shocking. And also when we wash those clothes, can you tell our listeners what happens then?
Yeah, so we've recently discovered this really horrifying phenomenon of microplastic, which is that if you take a garment and wash it in the washing machine, little tiny microscopic pieces of plastic leave that garment and go into the waterways, and that ends up in the ocean, where it is consumed by fish, and then those fish sometimes are eaten by bigger fish, which then consume a lot more of that plastic, and then finally that plastic sometimes ends up in our own food chain. And there have been some scientific studies that show that microplastics are actually pretty toxic to animals and to humans, because our body processes these tiny bits of plastic as foreign objects or toxins. So we know that that's happening, but also the plastic is a problem on so many levels, right? Because given that we basically treat clothes as disposable, a lot of this plastic is going to end up in a landfill, and there it's not going to biodegrade. It's just going to just clog up the planet, and release gases and greenhouse gases as it sits there over time.
Yes, and another shocking fact that I read in your one of your articles was that the average person, and I don't know if this was the US or worldwide, wears an item of clothing 7 to 10 times before discarding it.
Yeah, it's really, really shocking. I mean, I think that's so I think the statistic is that basically over the last decade, the number of basically there's this figure that they have, which is basically the utility or the usage that you get out of a garment, and basically that has gone down. I think 40%. And so basically, if you just think of all of the clothes that you have, even your favorite clothes, the clothes that you have in your closet, basically there's been a 40% decrease in the number of times you use that garment before you throw it out. And because so many of us treat our clothes as disposable, we buy them from season to season, then then the it's just a shocking, it's a shocking, shockingly few times that you're wearing a garment before it ends up in the trash. And when you think about the whole supply chain here, and like how much labor and how many resources and how many places that garment went to before arriving in your home, the fact that you wear it 7 times and then throw it away, it's just shocking and painful.
It's like the price tag of that t-shirt should be what, like $1,000?
Yeah, totally. Do you think if you're paying, I mean, it's so interesting. I mean, people are talking about this now all over the world of sustainability, but like, if you think about the externalities, as they call it, right? Like the ways that the garment that you have, is harming other people who will have to pay for it, whether it's the workers in India who are in cotton fields, and the chemicals that they're using to grow the cotton is harming their bodies. Like those people are going to seek medical care, and they're paying for that, and maybe we should be paying for that, right? Like those are our t-shirts that they're making, or all of the carbon emissions that are going to create natural disasters, or all of the ways that countries are having to deal with all of the waste in their landfills. Those are all things that we're producing, and yet we're buying that t-shirt for $5.99 from H&M.
So fast fashion is really, although it's made for clothes affordable for people, it's really, I would think, a large cause of these problems.
Totally. Yeah, and the fast fashion movement began, I think the first fast fashion brands sort of emerged in the 80s and then became the main way that we shopped in the 90s and 2000s. And so it's kind of the norm now. But I think that the message that I would like to communicate is that, it only took 20 years for this to be sort of 20 to 30 years for this to become the main way that we shopped. And kind of going back to what I was saying at the beginning, only 100 years ago, people had very, very different relationships with their clothes. So I think that it's possible if we, choose to change the way that we consume
Oops.
that.
Magic. That was like accentuating your your statement.
Yeah, hold on, let me just.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, going back 100 years, people shopped very, very differently. And so I think that the main thing to note here is that, if we were able to transform our shopping habits and our relationship with clothes so quickly into creating this kind of disposable fashion, then I think that we can try and, change that. I mean, it won't look exactly like it did 100 years ago, but I think that there are ways that we can tell the fashion industry that this is not how we want to shop and this is not how we want to clothe ourselves. And maybe 50 years from now, all of us will have a very different approach to clothing.
I think we will. And I like the idea that there is somewhat of a model for us from 100 years ago. And I think one of the solutions that you advocate for is regulation of the fashion industry. And you write that you think it should be regulated like oil and gas industries. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, I think that it's so interesting because as we said right at the start, we don't tend to think of a t-shirt or a dress as being terribly harmful to the environment. And I think that has led to a situation where governments don't really look at the fashion industry and think, wow, this is an industry that really needs to be regulated, even though there are many other industries that are equally polluting that have been regulated, like the airline industry, like the automotive industry, like the oil and gas industry. There are filters on cars that prevent particular toxins from entering our atmosphere. There's been a movement to make more energy efficient vehicles. There's been a shift towards trying to change things to become, more to move towards electric vehicles. There's been all of these changes that have happened in these other industries that have been led by, in part, governments that have been regulating them. And meanwhile, the fashion industry has been completely left out of this discussion. I think because it's really hard for us to pinpoint, exactly how bad the industry is for the environment. I think, it's hard to quantify. And also this is a vast, as we said earlier, this is a vast supply chain. And it's hard for any one government to sort of like make sense of, how much waste and how much pollution is happening at every stage. Whereas, like if you're the Toyota manufacturer in the U.S., or wherever, the government can say, okay, this is something that you're doing, and here let's regulate the way that you're manufacturing these cars, or the kinds of cars you're making. So I think that's part of that's the problem here, that the fashion industry has gotten away with all of this pollution for a long time, and governments are not doing anything about it. But there's some hope now that I'm seeing. In France, for instance, there is a minister within the government's division of, essentially their environmental protection division, who has made it her responsibility to focus on the fashion industry. And granted, France is still a major fashion capital. And so she's begun to create legislation on a couple of different dimensions. One is she has forbid the burning of excess inventory at the end of a season, and so that's a really important thing. So if brands can't burn product at the end of the season, they need to be a lot more careful about what they're producing and be careful not to overproduce. So that's one thing she's doing. She's also, speaking of the microplastic discussion we were having before, she is working on legislation that will make it so that every washing machine purchased in France has a filter in it that filters out these microplastics so they don't end up in the water stream. So those are a couple of things that she's doing, which only goes to show that if a government wants to take responsibility, for some of this, they can absolutely do so. There are things that we can do right now that can begin to regulate this industry.
So let's talk solutions. You mentioned regulations, and you also mentioned how some companies are really starting to do the right thing as far as responsibility. As consumers, what can we do to make our clothing purchases be more responsible toward the environment? And one of my favorites is shopping in my closet. Like, if I have to go somewhere, instead of going out and buying something new, I will just go in my closet and choose something I already have. It really
Yeah.
works. Yeah.
That's great. And I think that works especially when you have kind of a big event to go to, because I think that I know that just myself, as somebody who cares a lot about fashion, for a long time, going to a big event, a gala or a party or like a New Year's Eve party was like an opportunity for me to go out and buy, a fancy new dress. And I think that, that changing your thinking about that is just really a great thing to do. You have beautiful things in your closet already. You went through this whole process a year ago for last New Year's Eve. Maybe just go back to that dress. That's definitely one way to do it. I think in general, my advice would be, obviously, we're all trying to move to a world where we're just buying less and we're owning less. But I think that for that to really work, I think that you really need to love the pieces that you own. And so what does that mean? I mean, there already are. I mean, I think there's some research that says that, you only use and continue to wear a small proportion of the clothes in your closet. And what are those clothes? Those are your favorite jeans that, you feel like $1,000,000 when you wear them. It's your favorite soft t-shirt that, you've had for decades and it's just so comfortable. It's that like little black dress that you whip out, time after time because it looks good. It feels good. There's nothing, about it that you don't love. There are these pieces that you already have in your closet that you love. And so the goal is to just make sure that is all your closet, right? And so I think that what that means is that when you're thinking about buying something new, first of all, you got to stop and think, do I really need this? And if you do need it, really spend the time to try and figure out like, what is it about particular clothes that you like the best, right? So is it that, you generally like a particular type of material, there's a particular cut that looks good on you, there's a particular size that, works really well, whatever it is, go back to those principles of the things in your closet that you love a lot. Because I think that the way that we get people to stop buying so much is for them to just really love what they own. And I think that really cuts down on this constant need to just accumulate more and more stuff. If you feel really satisfied with the clothes that you have and you feel and you feel so excited to get up every day because you love the items in your closet, then I think that sort of begins to curb your need to just constantly accumulate more stuff.
Yes. And, I did recently, well, it's been about a year and a half, but I did I think Ann Patchett, the writer, said that I believe it was her, she said she was going to go on a clothes moratorium and just not buy any new items except socks and underwear and things like that. It's like a clothing new clothes fast. And I've been doing it with a few lapses for necessities. And then instead you take the money you'd save on instead of buying clothes and, get a trip or something like that. So that's been interesting to observe, and that's why the shopping in my closet really started to see, because that impulse, right, of wanting to buy things. I've also been buying, if I do really need something, from thrift stores.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I wanted your opinion on thrift stores, clothing swaps, mending and sewing, like all these different reuse ways of clothes shopping. Could you speak a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, there's many ways that brands are beginning to adapt to our desire for more sustainable options. So I think thrifting is an interesting one because now there are many thrift stores that have gone online. The biggest one is ThredUp, but there are many others online. And then there's the other approach, which is renting clothes. And so Rent the Runway is the biggest player on that side, but there are many other brands that are beginning to do that. Um, I think generally my approach here is that I think that it's possible to fall into the same patterns of overconsumption, even when you use these other better platforms. There's no doubt that if you are going to buy new clothes, or if you're going to stay in this world of of trying to stay on trend and have new clothes all the time, then getting either used clothes or renting clothes is better than the status quo, which is to go to a store and buy new clothes and then throw them out at the end of the season. That's certainly better, but I think that the overarching goal here is to maintain this kind of lean closet where you're not consuming so much. Because even if you're renting clothes and even if you're buying clothes secondhand, that still has an environmental footprint. And so it's possible to just shift your fast fashion mentality into that world. And it's definitely better than buying things traditionally at a store, but it's still not great, I think. And it still cultivates the sense that you constantly need new stuff.
We never have enough, exactly.
Totally. And so that's one side of it. But that said, we're always going to need new clothes. And and if you have to buy something, I think it's great to buy it off of ThredUp or from a store that sells used product. Because I just think that, there's so many, because we're in the state of overconsumption, there's somebody out there who bought something that is perfect for you, wore it one time, maybe didn't even wear it at all. Um, and has just decided to part with it and put it on one of these platforms. It is so much better to buy it off of a platform like that than to give your money to a brand that is constantly churning out new stuff, right? Because that product has already been made. It is already out there, and if you don't buy it, it's going to end up in a landfill. So I think that it's really it's a lot better than buying it from a store. But that said, my overarching philosophy is, let's just try and live with fewer clothes, just in general.
Yes, exactly. And so, is there anything else that I didn't ask you today that you'd like to share with listeners?
Hmm. I think that the fundamental thing that I would like to share is that, first of all, it didn't take us long to get into this mess in the fashion industry. And so I really do believe that we can dig our way out of this environmental mess that we're in right now. And secondly, I don't think that living in a sustainable way with clothing means that we have to give up the fun and excitement of wearing clothes. I think that living in a more sustainable way can mean that we really love the clothes that we do own and that we love getting dressed in the morning. And so this is not about living a sort of ascetic, monastic lifestyle. I think
With
that we
one
can.
robe, just one robe. It's got to be brown.
I know it's going to be ugly and brown and it has to look like a potato sack. No, that's not what it's going to be about. It's about wearing all of your favorite clothes all the time. That's what we're talking about.
That is great. And, really, I just want to stress, too, that we know that this is actually really a privileged problem to have, right? Because many people around the world really struggle to even afford to buy clothes.
Yeah, and if you go back to that original statistic about how many clothes are produced every year and how few people there are on Earth, what that means is that those of us who are in the developed world and have a lot of disposable income are basically buying much, much more than our fair share of what is produced every year. And so maybe we should stop.
Yeah, I agree. And where can people find you if they want to read more of your work online?
Sure. So I'm at Liz Segran. You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. I am a senior staff writer at Fast Company magazine, and I have a book coming out this month. It's called The Rocket Years: How Your 20s Launch the Rest of Your Life. And it's basically a book about the big decisions we make in our 20s and how they play out in the years to come. And so you can find me there too.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Sure. Thank you.
You've been listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. You can find us online at sustainableworldradio.com and also on iTunes. For more information about permaculture and ecology, visit the Sustainable World Media YouTube channel, where you'll find videos about permaculture, aquaponics, organic gardening, rainwater harvesting, and much, much more. Sustainable World Radio is a listener-supported program. If you like what we do, please consider making a donation to the show. I'm your host and producer, Jill Cloutier, and thank you so much for listening.